Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment. My name is Robert Hawkins. I'm the MLA for Yellowknife Centre, and I'm the chair of the Economic Development and Environment Committee, of which we're here today. Today, committee will be receiving a briefing from the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change Department and their officials regarding the transboundary water agreements and low water. I may be ad-lib and say, please slide some Site C information in there. Given the recent news story, it would be a missed opportunity not to at least talk about it. Please note that this to all people at large, please note that this meeting is being live streamed on the Assembly's legislative channel, and of course our millions of viewers on social media from around the world are probably waiting on every word of ours. I'll now quickly introduce members so we can move along. Online, we don't have anyone at this particular second, but on my right, I have Ms. Kate Reid, MLA for Great Slave. My far left, I have MLA Shauna Morgan, MLA for Yellowknife North, and Mr. Julian Morris, MLA for Frame Lake. So at this particular time, I'd like to thank our minister and their guests for coming, and at this time I'd like to pass the microphone on to you if you'd introduce your staff and please proceed to the presentation, and we'll go from there. And one last note, as a reminder, we are working through the mic system, so for identification purposes as well as those online, they cannot hear if we're on the mic, so please wait till it's been passed accordingly. So, Mr. Minister, if you would, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Good afternoon. I'm here today to brief you on the low water conditions that we are experiencing on the Mackenzie River. As residents of the North, we are experiencing firsthand the impacts that record-breaking low water levels are having on our environment and our way of life. Our water originates from Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, which are upstream of the Northwest Territories. The long-term health and condition of our waterways and collaboratively implementing strong transboundary agreements with these upstream jurisdictions is critical. Much of the questions that were the focus of the request for the briefing were technical and operational in nature. I have brought staff with me who can address those types of questions. I am happy to address any political questions. At this time, I'll turn it over to Deputy Minister Kelly to provide some comments and introduce the presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Minister, Dr. Kelly, please. We're on that.
So sorry. I'll get used to that right away. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. Here with the Minister and I today from the department are Mr. Julian Canagan, Assistant Deputy Minister of Environmental Management, Monitoring and Climate Change, and Dr. Ryan Connon, Senior Hydrologist, Water Monitoring and Stewardship Division. We are pleased to provide committee with more detailed information about current low water conditions, Site C, and our transboundary agreements. The extremely low water conditions in the NWT have been a topic of great interest across much of our territory. ECC staff have been regularly providing up-to-date information to the public, as well as to other GNWT departments to inform their decision-making, such as the Department of Infrastructure to inform their decisions regarding barging this season. Information sharing is also an important aspect of our transboundary agreements with neighboring jurisdictions. For example, Alberta has been sharing monthly water use data for the Hay River Basin. ECC staff are able to use this information to understand how much water is being used relative to low water levels. I would like to now turn it over to Julian Canagan and Dr. Ryan Connon, who will both take us through our presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Who should I start with? I believe you are Assistant Deputy Minister Canagan? Correct. Please, if you would.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just advance the slide. Okay, so Dr. Connon and I will share the presentation today. Just as a quick outline, we'll start with an update on low water levels for Great Slave Lake and the Mackenzie River. And we're aiming to respond to your questions related to forecasting future water levels and climate change. And then we'll briefly discuss how the department communicates with other GNWT departments about low water and the sharing of data and information to inform some of the decisions that are made. We'll also touch on the filling of Site C and the steps that ECC is taking to stay informed and to inform others. We'll also discuss the intent and purpose of transboundary water agreements, focusing on the governance structure and how information is shared. And we'll provide an update on the dispute resolution with Alberta that was initiated due to a lack of notification about the incidents at the Kira Lake Oil Sands Mine in 2022 and 2023. I'm going to pass the presentation to Dr. Khan. With your permission.
Thank you. Dr. Cannon, did I get it right, or Con? Yes, if you would please.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to begin, it's worth highlighting the size of the Mackenzie River Basin. So most of the water in Great Slave Lake and on the Mackenzie River comes from precipitation falling outside of the NWT. On the slides here, you can see any precipitation falling within the shaded green area on the image to the right will eventually flow to the Mackenzie River. Annual precipitation in southern areas of the basin is much higher than annual precipitations in northern areas, which is why more water comes from precipitation outside of the NWT, despite the fact that the Mackenzie River Basin has an approximately equal landmass within and outside the NWT. The GNWT partners with the Water Survey of Canada to run the NWT Hydrometric Monitoring Network. This network measures water levels and flows in lakes, rivers, and creeks in the NWT, with a data record starting as early as the 1930s for some locations. The Water Survey of Canada is responsible for taking the physical measurements at the hydrometric sites, and because the Water Survey of Canada is a federal organization, they ensure that all measurements across the country are completed the same way and ensure that all data are publicly available. And this makes it easy to view real-time provisional data collected in the NWT and also in our neighboring jurisdictions. And this map on the right here shows the locations of all of the gauges, both within the NWT and within the Mackenzie River Basin. Sorry, I think I jumped a slide. So I'll touch now on some of the record low water levels that we've seen lately in the NWT. The Mackenzie River Basin has experienced extreme drought conditions from the summer of 2022 until present. And during this time, many residents in the NWT were forced to evacuate their communities due to the threat of wildfires. These hot and dry conditions that cause the extreme fire behavior have also led to historically low water levels in many regions of the NWT. In southern NWT, many of the gauged rivers and lakes have approached or exceeded the lowest values on record over the past 2 years. These low water levels are the result of extremely hot and dry conditions in consecutive summers of 2022 and 2023, and now through to 2024. Climate stations in many communities in the southern NWT recorded the driest and hottest summers on record in 2023. And the hot conditions result in more water evaporating from lakes and transpiring from plants, which serves to desiccate and dry out the soils. There have been previous instances of very dry summers in the NWT, but they were not combined with the level of record heat that we experienced in 2023, nor were they preceded by a summer like 2022, which was also abnormally hot and dry. And it is worth mentioning that the extreme drought experienced across the NWT was immediately preceded by a period of record high water levels. And scientists have been saying for many years that climate change will lead to an increased frequency and magnitude of extreme events, including high precipitation and widespread drought. The NWT has witnessed both of these extremes over the last 5 years. Now I'll direct your attention to some of the figures on the screen here. This first figure is of Great Slave Lake at Yellowknife Bay, and the figure on the left shows water levels on Great Slave Lake over the past 3 years. The light gray bands represent historic maximum and minimum values prior to 2022, and the dark gray band represents the average range over the historic record. And this graph shows how water levels transitioned from record high in 2022, the light blue line there, to record lows in 2024, which is the red line. And this is a drop of over 1.2 meters over the span of 2 years. And the figure on the right depicts the area of land that drains water into Great Slave Lake. The Slave River brings most of the water from BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan to Great Slave Lake, which accounts for about 75 to 80% of all of the water in Great Slave Lake. The water levels in the lake are therefore directly a result of climatic patterns or upstream influences. And this plot here shows the same data as before, but as a continuous time series. And what is highlighted here are the extreme fluctuations that have been observed over the last 5 years. And as was mentioned earlier, increases in extreme events are projected with a warming climate, but the result is not unidirectional. This slide shows the same information as the previous slides, but displays water level data for the Mackenzie River at Norman Wells. As can be seen here, water levels in the Mackenzie River have been at or near record low values for the entire summer of 2024. Most of the water on the Mackenzie River at Norman Wells is derived from Great Slave Lake, but about a third of that water comes from the Liard River, which drains parts of southern Yukon and northern British Columbia. And this here is a visual depiction of the change in water levels on the Mackenzie River at Norman Wells between record high levels in 2022, which is the light blue circle on the top there, and record low water levels in 2024. And these pictures were taken from the exact same location at the hydrometric gauge. One of the major pinch points for transportation along the Mackenzie River is the ramparts just south of Fort Good Hope. This slide shows satellite images of the ramparts during low water levels this summer and when water levels were approximately average last May in 2023. The image on the left shows that the ramparts are not navigable during the current low water conditions. Oh, sorry, the image on the left, sorry. And now we'll touch on some of the hydrological and climate modeling that we do in the NWT. Unfortunately, it's not possible to say when water levels will return to normal. Water levels are the product of weather patterns, so precipitation and temperature, which are becoming increasingly difficult to predict under a changing climate, and to a lesser extent, upstream development, which impacts the timing and seasonality of flows on the Slave River, Great Slave Lake, and Mackenzie River. ECC does not have a physically based hydrological model for the Mackenzie River Basin. We have a prototype model for the Liard Basin, and development of models is underway for other subbasins as well. Process-based models are best suited to running predictions based on forecast weather data, but they will only ever be as good as the weather forecasts that use as input data for them. ECC scientists are working with Environment and Climate Change Canada scientists to develop machine learning approaches to modeling the Mackenzie River Basin, but this approach has high levels of uncertainty when water levels are outside of historic bounds, as they have been for the last 5 years. More generally, the El Niño Southern Oscillation teleconnection is transitioning from an El Niño phase to a La Niña phase. We are currently in a neutral phase, but are anticipating the La Niña phase to begin around October. A La Niña phase typically brings cooler temperatures and more snowfall to Western Canada in the winter. However, the amount of snow and the location of where that snow will fall are still unknown. ECC scientists give regular updates on water levels to infrastructure and MACA to inform GNWT operations. And further to your point at the start of this presentation, Mr. Speaker, what was it, Julian's turn? Sorry.
Thank you. Assistant Deputy Minister, you wish to pick up from here?
As you mentioned, I'll pick up on the second area that we wanted to touch on, which was upstream hydroelectric generation. There's been a number of questions posed as to how hydroelectric generation along the Upper Peace River in British Columbia will impact water levels on Great Slave Lake, including questions about the filling of the Site C reservoir. So BC Hydro stated that they intend to start filling the Site C reservoir in late August, which in fact they've done, and that it will take up to 4 months to complete. The Site C reservoir is significantly smaller than the Williston Lake Reservoir, which is held behind the WAC Bennett Dam. The volume of the Site C reservoir would amount to approximately 8.5 centimeters if spread out over the surface area of Great Slave Lake. But to put this in context, water levels on Great Slave Lake have dropped by over 120 centimeters from climate-driven drought over the last 2 years. the 8.5 centimeter loss on Great Slave Lake would not be permanent as water is always moving through the system. So in the environmental impact assessment submitted by BC Hydro for the Site C Dam in 2013, hydraulic modeling by BC Hydro engineers showed that water level changes due to releases of water from the Site C reservoir would not be noticeable downstream of the community of Peace River in Alberta, as the addition of water from other rivers would mitigate the impact. ECC scientists suggest that this modeling did not consider the cumulative effects on Great Slave Lake water levels when there are prolonged high or low flows on the Peace River. BC Hydro has committed that flow releases will be within the limits of their water license. Given the record low water levels on Great Slave Lake, the ECC minister wrote a letter to BC Hydro last summer to ask about delaying the filling of Site C given the current low water level conditions. BC Hydro responded by saying that they do not believe there will be any impact to downstream water levels. ECC has recently sent another letter to ask BC Hydro if they would be willing to establish an information sharing agreement with the GNWT to provide more details of their downstream considerations. This agreement would be similar to the data sharing agreement BC Hydro already has with the Government of Alberta. And I would note that the NWT transboundary agreement with BC applies to the Liard River and not the Peace River. Therefore, BC does not have information sharing obligations to the NWT regarding Peace River and its hydroelectric operations. The third area we wanted to discuss today was transboundary water governance. So to give you a high-level overview, bilateral transboundary water agreements that we have with our neighboring jurisdictions are a key tool that we use to share information and cooperatively manage our shared waters. The Mackenzie River Basin Transboundary Water Masters Agreement was signed in 1997 by the federal government and the provincial and territorial governments within the Mackenzie River Basin. So that includes Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, NWT, and the Yukon. The Master Agreement sets out key principles for the jurisdictions to work together to maintain the health of the Mackenzie River Basin. It also establishes the Mackenzie River Basin Board, and it commits the provinces and territories in the basin to negotiate bilateral water management agreements. The bilateral water management agreements are long-term cooperative agreements to maintain the health of the aquatic ecosystem. They facilitate joint learning and proactive actions, and they provide for early and effective information sharing and notification mechanisms between jurisdictions. The agreements do acknowledge the right of each jurisdiction to use and manage its own water resources while not causing unreasonable harm to the aquatic ecosystem in the downstream jurisdiction. The NWT is the ultimate downstream jurisdiction in the Mackenzie River Basin, except with Nunavut, where the NWT is the upstream jurisdiction. And as Brian mentioned, much of the NWT's water resources are influenced by management decisions in upstream jurisdictions, particularly those made in BC and Alberta. Currently, the GNWT has signed bilateral water management agreements with Alberta, completed in 2015, BC, completed in 2015, and Yukon, completed in 2022. We are actively implementing those agreements in cooperation with those respective jurisdictions. We are undertaking negotiations with Saskatchewan and Nunavut towards bilateral water management agreements. So to give a bit of insight into how these agreements work, once each bilateral water management agreement is signed, a bilateral management committee is established to implement the agreement. Membership on these committees includes at least one senior water manager from each provincial or territorial government and may include representation from Indigenous governments or Indigenous organizations. In the NWT, an intergovernmental agreement with Indigenous governments and organizations on implementation of transboundary agreements was developed in 2015. This agreement allows for the NWT Water Strategy Indigenous Steering Committee, which has membership for the regional Indigenous governments and Indigenous organizations in the NWT, to recommend one of its members to sit on each of the bilateral management committees, currently for Alberta, BC, and the Yukon. Key responsibilities of each bilateral management committee are to develop and approve work plans and budgets, classify transboundary waters based on risk, and the classification dictates the management actions for a water body. They establish priorities for joint learning, monitoring, and research. They set, monitor, and assess transboundary objectives, and they bring forward input and interests from their public and Indigenous governments and organizations. The committees also share information about the aquatic ecosystem and provide notification of proposed developments and activities and of any spills or emergencies that could affect the downstream jurisdiction's aquatic ecosystem. Finally, they undertake actions to resolve disputes, and if they cannot be resolved, they refer disputes to the ministers. Reporting is also one duty of the BMC. An annual report is to be submitted by the BMC to responsible ministers to document implementation activities of the agreement and report on monitoring results for Class 3 water bodies, which are the Slave and Hay Rivers at this time. These reports are a key way to share information with the public about the agreements and upstream activities. 5 annual reports have been published for the NWT Alberta Agreement, and they include water quality and quantity data assessment and an update on implementation activities. These reports are available online on our website and the MRBB website, along with other technical reports that are initiated under the implementation of the agreement, such as biological monitoring and groundwater studies. We anticipate releasing a 6th report shortly. 2 reports have been completed for the BC NWT agreement, and another report is close to completion. The bilateral management committees are currently working on a new approach to reporting to improve efficiency and reduce delays in reporting. Information sharing, prior notification, and consultation are key parts of each agreement. The Bilateral Management Committee is the central body through which information is shared between our two jurisdictions. The jurisdictions, particularly the upstream jurisdiction, are obliged to share information related to the aquatic ecosystem, about upstream developments and activities, and about any spills or emergencies that could affect the downstream jurisdiction's aquatic ecosystem. In addition to ongoing information sharing, the committees meet at least twice per year, and additional meetings take place to discuss topics of interest. With respect to the Alberta Agreement, regular information sharing meetings also occur between assistant deputy ministers and between deputy ministers on a bi-monthly basis. Standing agenda items include updates on oil sands monitoring program, technical studies, and regulation development for potential release of treated oil sands mine water, as well as resolving the dispute related to the spill incident at Imperial Oil's Kira Lake oil sands mine. Currently, information related to spill incidents is shared by email with the GNWT Bilateral Management Committee member and other staff within the ECC division. With respect to the dispute resolution regarding the Kira oil sands mine, the committee has expressed interest in receiving an update on this and the lack of notification of the seepage and spill from the mine. Because the GNWT found out about the late January 2023 spill, as well as seepage that had been occurring since May 2022 from an Indigenous government and not the Government of Alberta, the GNWT initiated a dispute resolution process under the agreement due to a lack of notification from Alberta in March 2023. Given the level of concern, the dispute was referred to ministers. 2 meetings between ministers occurred to discuss the issue virtually on March 9th and in person on April 19th, 2023. The Bilateral Management Committee then met on June 15th, 2023 and discussed resolution of the issue. The GNWT and Government of Alberta are currently working to resolve the dispute by improving Alberta's notification protocols and establishing clear criteria that would trigger notification in the event of an incident that could affect the ecological integrity of the aquatic ecosystem of the GNWT. Alberta is currently reviewing the proposed criteria and considering including the GNWT in their internal notification system. And we would note that information sharing from Alberta has improved considerably since the incidents. That's the end of the presentation. Thank you to the chair and committee members for your attention.
Thank you very much to everyone so far. We certainly appreciate the updates. And when I was specifically asking about Site C, I knew it was in the presentation. I didn't know if you had, say, late-breaking news in the sense of the announcement, but that's certainly fine. And I suspect it'll be within our questions around the table, so I won't preempt committee at this time. And if I feel something's still out there, I'll ask, and I'm sure we'll figure it out or find our way through it. So the first person I have who would like to start with some questions is MLA Reid, and I'll go to her first, and then we'll go from there. So MLA Reid, please, if you would.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, folks, for your presentation. I have a question that you might not have at your fingertips, and if that's the case, that's fine. You mentioned that there was a drop of 1.2 meters in Yellowknife Bay. Do we know how many cubic meters of water loss that is? Thank you.
Okay, no problem. You have to wait for the microphone, and just before I cue you, what I was going to say is you guys were perfect, rather than us going back and forth. So yes, if it's a technical question, just point at the person. I'll go straight to them. So thank you very much. You guys were awesome. Dr. Connon, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have that information off the top of my head, but I can do that calculation and send that number to you.
Thank you, Dr. Connon. On behalf of committee, I'll accept it to be sent to committee so we can share it amongst ourselves. And that way, of course, Ms. MLA Reid will get it. MLA Reid, please, if you would.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you. I didn't necessarily expect you to have that at your fingertips, so that's perfectly all right. But, you know, with the great variation that we're seeing and the extreme swings that you noted in your presentation, you've also noted in your presentation that modeling will be and predictions will be unpredictable when there are such large swings outside of the historic bounds. That said, could you speak a little bit generally about what implications that might have for our own NWT hydroelectric generation for specifically the South Slave, but also for the North Slave in the Cleachon region? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, MLA. Dr. Connon, there we go.
Thank you. And I believe we would need to defer that question to NTPC as they're in charge, or our infrastructure department as they're in charge of those operations. In terms of building, I would defer to those groups as that is something they're in charge of.
Thank you, Doctor. I go to Dr. Kelly for a little further. Thank you.
I think while NTPC does their own modeling work, and I understand what Dr. Connon is saying, I think in general what we can say is that any modeling, when you're using data that's on the outside of what is normal, has increased error that is associated with it, which makes predictions very challenging. And in my knowledge of NTPC, I know that they're having challenges similar to what Dr. Connon has previously spoken about. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that. Any follow-up specific to that, or if not, I'll go to another member. Okay, thanks. Mr. Morris, if you would.
Thank you. Just a quick one. Thanks for all the information. I appreciate it. It's really informative. I was just curious about, some of the letters that the minister's been sending to BC Hydro specifically, and was kind of wondering, because my understanding is that the bilateral agreement would be with the BC government themselves. So why are we kind of engaging with the corporation as opposed to the government? And maybe you could just kind of describe how that relationship works and who's really accountable. Like if BC Hydro is, drawing down Great Slave Lake by a certain number of centimeters, and we have concerns with that. Who's ultimately accountable for that? Is the BC government, who you have a bilateral agreement with? Is it BC Hydro? Is it kind of a mix? I'd just be curious to know a bit more about that relationship. Thanks.
Minister, would you like to start off, please?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. It's a two-part, I guess a two-part answer, so I'll just speak briefly and then I'll pass it over to Dr. Kelly. But so we have sent a letter directly to the BC government to talk about how we will share information. The piece with the BC Hydro is the letter that we've provided to them is about an MOU to share information with them. So the Peace River flows into Alberta and not into the NWT. So it's a little different situation than where with Alberta, where it flows directly into the NWT. So with that, I'll pass it to Dr. Kelly and have her add from there.
Thank you, Minister. Dr. Kelly, if you would, please.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, Mr. Chair. We only have transboundary agreements with jurisdictions that we have direct transfer of water. But one of the things that Alberta has to do on their agreement is share information, which means, as they put it during negotiations, they're the meat in the sandwich. So you'll notice in email correspondence recently that we receive information on Site C from Alberta because they get it from BC and then we get it from Alberta. And as the minister mentioned, we're hoping we can have an information sharing agreement, so we're getting that information directly from BC as well. And there has been collaboration between BC and NWT at the scientific level and Alberta on what those downstream inputs look like and potential effects look like. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that. Appreciate the insights. Emily Morris?
Thanks. Yeah, just out of curiosity on this line, I'm kind of curious. Like, I assume the Site C project has a water license. I don't quite know how the regime works in BC, but I mean, would the NWT be considered kind of an impacted party that they have to do mitigations for, considering that the dam can affect water levels? Or can the minister or staff kind of just explain to committee kind of how that works and what their obligations are if they were to impact water levels on Great Slave Lake? I think that'd be interesting for us to know more about.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. Dr. Kelly, if you could, with that question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the GNWT took part in the regulatory process for the Site C dam and brought forward concerns that we had, including potential impacts on waters in the NWT. I think that Dr. Conan mentioned that and also Assistant Deputy Minister Canagan mentioned that they're saying that there will not be impacts on Great Slave Lake. So we're lucky that we have great scientists like Dr. Conan who are looking at that data and reviewing it and doing the modeling so that we have that understanding, and we have folks that are looking to see if there are any potential impacts. And our minister has already written to express our concern related to that, particularly because of the low water levels that we already have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Nothing further. I'll go back to MLA Reid, and then, Ms. Morgan, maybe you can go first because you haven't asked a question yet.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my questions dig further into mechanisms of dispute resolution. I understand that there's now like an info sharing agreement with BC Hydro, but it seems like, you know, we're still stuck in this. They're saying, oh, well, there's not going to be downstream impacts. And we say, well, yes, there is. So what's the path forward? I know that, you know, one thing we're striving towards is just for them to notify us when things are happening, but that's not really going to resolve the dispute per se, right? Just to get notified that our water levels are going to drop. So in that case in particular, when Alberta is sandwiched in the middle, is there currently a mechanism for, like, is there a chance to have a referee at some point in the middle that goes, which scientists are right? If your scientists say, no, there's no impact, and yours say, yes, there is, is there a way to work through that and actually have there be consequences or like some definitive answer come out of that? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go to Dr. Kelly, if you would, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we do not have a transboundary agreement with BC that is on the Peace River. That is why we are asking for this information sharing agreement. Legal mechanisms still apply whether there's a transboundary agreement or not, and that's always the end game. We're trying to build a relationship with British Columbia and with BC Hydro, and what they've modeled and what they're saying in their environmental assessment is now being tested as we go, and Ryan and others at the department are monitoring it to see what the change is. But we know, and you saw in the presentation, that the change is small compared to what we're seeing from the drought, right? It's not a large amount comparatively. So should we have a dispute, that would go between the departments and then up to the ministerial level, but it wouldn't be part of an agreement per se, because we don't have that agreement for the peace with BC.
Yep. No. Thank you for that. Emily Morgan, please.
Thank you. And my second question actually related to dispute resolution with Alberta over the Kearl oil spill. So you explained how you did go through the dispute resolution process and Alberta had failed to notify the GNWT as per the protocols. When you had the meetings and dispute resolution with Alberta, did they have an excuse for not notifying the GNWT? Was it just like, oops, we forgot? Or was there a problem with the protocol per se? Like, does it require reworking the actual agreement, or they just kind of didn't follow the agreement for whatever reason? And if so, like, how do we actually get them to follow what we've already negotiated? Thank you.
Thank you for that. Dr. Kelly, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to respond and then ask if Julian has anything to add. But what I would say is that Alberta is a big government, and the department that we have the agreement with is not the department that has all of the information about what is happening. So Alberta Energy Regulator is the one that was providing information on this. So there's two things. There's an interpretation of the agreement where Alberta has said that what was happening at Kearl would not have impacted the waters of the GNWT, of the NWT, so they didn't, under the agreement, have to tell us. They have been really good about understanding why, when things are in the media, it's important that we know in advance and that we can provide information to communities, and why that increased information sharing with us is beneficial, to the point where we have received more information on small spills than we actually think that we need to receive, because they're being very open with that sharing. I think it just needs to be finalized on how this works, so that if different people move out of the system, that we're still getting the information that we need. So I would definitely say that Alberta, and I should qualify too, this isn't the first time that we haven't received information. So we've worked through some of those other examples as well, and they've had meetings with Julian that he can speak to on how the actual intricacies work within the Alberta government for sharing that information. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Minister. I go to the Assistant Deputy Minister, if you would please help us further. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just to elaborate on that point a bit, I think there's an easier part where we can define maybe the volume of a thing that we'd like to know, spill or so on, but the harder part to define is around what's of interest to the public, or what's of interest to NWT, Indigenous governments and residents, and that, like Alberta, Government of Alberta on its own may not be interpreting that in the same way that we are. So coming to an agreement and then how to actually have that conveyed to the NWT is what is taking a bit more time to figure out, and how to make that robust so that it's not dependent on people, but it's a process that's written down and followed so anyone can follow it.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. MLA Reid. Ms. Reid, if you would, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm sorry if this was mentioned when I was out of the room, just briefly. But my question is whether or not there is an interest to renegotiate or look at the agreement with British Columbia to include the Peace River Basin in addition to trying to build that relationship with BC Hydro. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, MLA Reid. Ms. Kelly, Dr. Kelly, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Julian mentioned the master agreement that is for the entire basin, and that master agreement sets out which agreements will be done as bilateral agreements. So it's always with the jurisdiction that the water is coming from into your jurisdiction. So we can't negotiate under the master's agreement with BC for a transboundary agreement on the Peace because Alberta's that meat in the sandwich situation that we mentioned. We have been able to negotiate with Alberta so that they'll share information that they get from BC, and we're working with BC to have that information sharing so that we can work directly with them as well. But it's not possible under the structure that we have with the master's agreement to negotiate that agreement. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And thank you for that. And just before I go to MLA Reid again, there is a bilateral agreement for BC, a bilateral for the Yukon, and Alberta. Just process-wise. If I'm missing any, I don't think I am. MLA Reid, if you want.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That dovetails nicely into my next question. There is no bilateral with Saskatchewan. You're negotiating that currently. And I recognize to your comments previously about the implications on hydroelectric generation is NTPC modeling, fair enough. But obviously, an agreement settled with Saskatchewan would feed into the Tulsan basin and possibly have impacts in that regard if we build out that particular project. So could you speak more to the status of the negotiations with Saskatchewan as is available to speak about publicly? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, not a problem. Assistant Deputy Minister Kennigan, please. Everyone was pointing in different directions for a second. Apparently, they're all now pointing at you. So please, if you would.
Yeah, so I'm pleased to let you know that discussions are well underway, and we've been working towards a draft agreement. And there's a few issues left that we're working through. And the process from there would be to start looking at some of the appendices as well. So we're hoping, well, I shouldn't put a timeline to this, I suppose, but we're hoping in the next couple of years to have something to bring forward.
Okay, thanks. Anything further, Ms. Reid, regarding that? Okay, thanks. Maybe just geopolitical, because I don't have anyone on the list for questions here, is that is there any proposal or consideration or even work being done currently right now on multi-jurisdictional challenges? So as we've highlighted, and you've were very good in your answer, Deputy Minister, which is you have a bilateral to share information from Alberta that BC shares with them, but not appreciating that when you're at the end of the line, you know, in the sense of a lot can happen before it gets there. And so I'm just curious on how multi-jurisdictions come together, if they do at all, to talk about that interrelationship, because what might happen in, say, the Kootenays, I'm not trying to be specific geographically, but reference in the sense of principle or point, which is something might happen in the Kootenays, you don't see it until, you know, a couple weeks, couple months later in Peace River, and a couple months later in Fort Smith area. So I mean, that type of communication relationship is probably important, and it may not be relevant to folks in Fort Smith today, but 2 months from now it'll be a panic. So hence that good communication relationship. So Dr. Kelly, would you have, or even the minister maybe, sorry, my apologies first, would you have any comment with respect to sort of how working together? So who should I go to first? Minister?
Yes, thank you for the question. And I think that, you know, it's always been our intent is to try and create as many of these relationships with our neighboring provinces as possible, because like you make a very good point there. I think it's important to ensure that we have the tools in place to ensure that we're able to inform our territory and our residents of things that do happen in other jurisdictions. So I'll pass it over to Dr. Kelly to add to that.
Thank you for that. Dr. Kelly, if you could further assist. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So under the that master agreement that we're developing, the bilaterals, there's a thing called the Mackenzie River Basin Board, where all of the jurisdictions in Canada meet, and there's Indigenous representatives from each of those jurisdictions, and they look at the basin as a whole, so that it's not just those bilateral agreements. There's a way to look at the basin as a whole. They have a State of the Aquatic Ecosystem report that includes traditional knowledge. They look at ways that we can collaboratively develop protocols and guidelines so that they're similar throughout where possible, because it's not always possible, but throughout the Mackenzie River Basin. There's sometimes opportunities for research and monitoring to be done collaboratively, so that's a place that's talked about, and they've been doing some work on what that could look like with respect to being part of the Canada Water Agency or contributing to the Canada Water Agency. It's very good for information sharing, not as good for dispute resolution, I would say. You can have conversations about challenges, but it's not a place where those things would be addressed. That's done on a jurisdictional basis, a jurisdiction to jurisdictional basis. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Very good. That was very helpful. Just one further, slightly different direction, but same issue, obviously. How do we address the cumulative effects of these type of ripple effects of challenges? Any thoughts, Dr. Kelly?
So that same group has done some work on cumulative effects, and then there's work within each jurisdiction that looks at that as well. And in the learning plan, if I recall correctly, and maybe Julian can correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been a while since I did this type of work. In the learning plan, there's sections on cumulative effects specifically, where when you have a class 3 river, Julian mentioned, like the Slave and the Hay River, we have learning plans, so there's certain things that we need to do, and one of those things is to look at the potential for cumulative effects.
I've got a couple more questions. I'll just keep them moving along, and that way if committee members want to jump in, just let me know. A couple more on my list is the State of the Aquatic Ecosystem report. Do you have an update, or can you provide an update, or a drive-by update in the sense of it's being worked on? Dr. Kelly?
They're done regularly and then posted publicly, so we're always working on a State of the Aquatic Ecosystem report for the basin. And then there's the reporting annually for the bilateral agreements. One of the challenges with water data for water quality is it takes a long time to get your samples back. So it takes longer to do these reports than what we're hoping. As Julian mentioned, we're working with Alberta to try to see how we can streamline that process and get the reporting out more regularly. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I saw that last part in the presentation, and I think my worry is back to that oversimplified example earlier, is that if reporting's slow, how do you know something happened until it's far too late? How do you protect themselves? Dr. Kelly?
Folks are looking at the data when it comes in, so we would know right away, and we have an Indigenous steering committee that we're also working with, and and we would make that public if there was, as soon as we got the data. It's the report writing and the analysis of that data to look for trends that takes time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
No, thank you. I have a few more questions because I was busy taking notes during the presentation. On slide 10, it noted that we are in a neutral phase for right now between El Nina. I think that's close enough. I'm sure you know what I mean. How do you assess, or where do you see the impact of the snow load coming this winter? I mean, are you seeing an impact? Are you predicting an impact? Are we just one of those, I hate to say, wait and see? I'm just, because I mean, we've got a lot of stress. Well, I suspect you have more stress than us, but as legislators, we hear lots of stress about water access and certainly the transportation system, et cetera, and the ripple effect of that. So Do you have any thoughts, or are you getting indications that this weather pattern this year should be favorable for snow loads, for example? Because looking at your water charts, it's dropped significantly from 2022 to 2023, and my goodness, we're way below last year's mark. So any thoughts regarding the Dr. Conant, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's a great question. So we are transitioning into La Nina system. I would say it's more likely than not that we will get more snow than usual this winter, as is typically the case with La Nina. However, that doesn't always happen. There have been some instances in the past where we've been in the La Nina phase and we've received less snow than normal or about average snow. But typically, during La Nina phases, we do get more snow than normal. That's what we're anticipating to see. The other thing is these La Nina weather patterns will impact sort of Western Canada broadly. So we can't say with certainty where the snow is going to fall exactly, if it will be in the Mackenzie River Basin or if it might be just south or excuse me, or just west of the Mackenzie River Basin. But if we look at historical trends, typically as we move into La Nina, we will expect to see a colder than normal winter, as well as a winter with more snowfall than normal. And we're also not sure, the other side of the coin here is it's not a yes or no, we're in a La Nina phase. There's also different strengths to La Nina, and we've been working with meteorologists from Environment and Climate Change Canada to get a sense of the strength, and they're not quite sure. We're a little bit far out to know how strong the La Nina will be this winter, but if it's a stronger La Nina than normal, then there's a higher chance that we'll receive more snow than normal. So I guess it is we're not quite sure, but all signs are pointing to it's more likely than not that we will receive more snow than normal this winter.
Thank you very much. And, Minister, please, if you would.
Certainly, maybe just to add to that, so when we had our spring seasonal forecast provided by our meteorologist at the start of the fire season, at that time she indicated that in order to get out of our current drought situation, we would require about 300% of normal precip. So, just to provide a little bit of context to what Dr. Conant had to say. So.
Still a dry summer in BC by 300%. Wow, that's a lot of water compared to ours. Okay, so two jobs that you can predict terribly are weather and economists, and nobody seems to care. MLA Reid, and then I have MLA Morris. Ms. Reid, if you would, please.
Certainly, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I think the Minister stole my thunder a little bit. I was going to say, how much precipitation would we need to exit the drought? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, you can turn it into a political question. Will you deliver, Minister? Or the honorable thing? I guess no answer. Very good. Minister, if you had some insight on MLA Reid's question, that would be most helpful.
Thank you. Could you repeat the question? I kind of lost it in the banter there.
MLA Reid, if you could reapproach your question, that would be most helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe you could minimize the jokes and we won't get lost anymore. That'd be great too. I'm curious what level of precipitation, you said 300% obviously earlier, but what would that look like for the NWT to exit the drought? What kind of snowfall or would we need to see this winter to make a real impact in the drought conditions? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that, and I actually thought you were joking. My apologies for that, sincerely. Mr. Minister or Dr. Kelly? Dr. Kelly, please.
So thank you, Mr. Chair. So as the Minister said, you would need 300%, but it's different depending where you are across the territory and what the drought conditions are. And then you have to factor in what the conditions are when melt happens. So you can get a lot of snow, And if it sublimates to the atmosphere, it doesn't help with the situation that we have going on. So unfortunately, I don't think there really is an answer to the question that the member has. Our hope is that we get as much snow as we possibly can, and it ends up in the systems in the NWT, because we've had some sublimation issues recently with snow melt as well, and it doesn't help when it goes back to the atmosphere. Thank you.
MLA Reid, anything further? Nope. All right. Just to clarify, you said, could you repeat that word? It's the first time I've heard it, but I understand the appreciation of what you meant. You said sublimates. Did I say it correctly? Okay, so I'm seeing a nod. Are we impacted a lot by that? Because it never seems, we seem to have a lot of snow, but it just seems that the ground doesn't seem wet. Again, it's a term I'm not familiar with, but I'm totally familiar with the concept. Dr. Conan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sublimation is what would happen, for example, when snow foregoes the melt phase, so when snow directly, essentially when the snow evaporates to the atmosphere, when it goes from a solid state to a gas state without first melting. And across the NWT, sublimation, I would say, could impact anywhere from, could lose between 10 to 30% of a snowpack to sublimation. Sublimation will happen when you have clear skies, lots of sun, warmer temperatures. You have essentially a strong temperature gradient from the snowpack to the atmosphere. So clear skies, lots of sun will lead to sublimation.
That was very helpful. Again, I'm familiar with the experience, just not the term. I'll have to work it in my vernacular. So thank you. MLA Morse, I believe you're next.
Right, thank you. I have to admit this question is a little bit of a personal interest question, but since I have a hydrologist in front of me, I'm going to ask it. I've been very curious. You mentioned in your presentation that the Great Slave Lake has dropped just over a meter. Do you guys actually have a calculation as to the volume of water contained in a meter of surface area of Great Slave Lake? Oh, it was your question. But, okay, maybe I missed it, but I am curious what that number is. And you said you're going to get back to us with it. Okay, sorry. I guess if it's been answered, that's it for me.
Yeah, it was. I think that was Miss Reid's question earlier. I think her first question, as a matter of fact, and Dr. Conan has said that he'll see what he can come up with in the information. But I'll go to the minister in case he has anything further he wants to add, and then I'll come back to you. Or does anyone have anything? No, I'm not seeing anyone. So, Emily Morse, anything further? Okay. Maybe just on that note, I had a notation here earlier. I think you said the. If I'm correct, I'm not going to go to the slide, but I think if I'm correct, I remember it's saying Great Slave Lake has dropped 1.2 meters, and the Site C is dropping about 8.5 centimeters. It may not sound like a lot, in the range of 6.5% per se, but generally speaking, 8.5 centimeters may not have mattered in 2021, but in 2024, that is a large significance, like in the sense of the impact. So when we were talking about unreasonable, and I think that I made a note that was on slide 13, and frankly, I think the reason I'm drawing that out is unreasonable or interpretation and whatnot is how do we deal with these conversations? And I'm curious because we as in the territories, the territorial government, individuals have one interpretation of what's reasonable and unreasonable on these types of things. And how do we deal with these challenges? And I can appreciate the conversation's going to happen, but I mean, eventually someone's going to have to define what unreasonable is. So I'm stuck. I know it's a bit of a difficult question, but how do you folks approach it from the ECC point of view on behalf of the citizens of the North? So. Dr. Kelly?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it's up to 8.5 centimeters. So that's a modeled amount. So we're not sure, and it could be anywhere in between. And as Julian mentioned, there's always water entering the system in other places. So it's not like all of a sudden we'll see 8.5 centimeters on the lake, right? I think the way that we handle it right now is we keep doing the monitoring and watching and modeling and trying to have these data sharing agreements so we know as much as we can. And then if we do see that impact, we have to go and talk to BC about it, which would be a political intervention by our minister, and I'm sure he's happy to chat about that. But we don't know that's what's predicted. We don't know what's going to happen and how we're going to see it. And the next step is to watch what happens over the next 4 months, right? And if need be, then talk to our colleagues and, if necessary, political intervention.
Fair enough. I'm just trying to, I mean, it's, I think, something we're all struggling with, and, okay. Transparent, I think that's my questions. Does committee have any further questions? Not seeing anything from committee. So folks, maybe at this particular time, I'll just not drag it on, but I'll just talk a little slow as we wrap up. Any last questions from committee members before we close the hearing? Okay, not seeing any. So folks, at this particular time, I'm going to call a close to our presentation. I will, in a moment, go to the minister for a chance to close on his side of the table. I'd like to thank our presenters for the information given. I'm grateful that we were able to do this in public and online. It'll be posted on the Legislative Assembly website. This is very important information. It's mind-boggling how big it is and its ripple effects and its cumulative effects on everything, whether it happens in BC and then it trends into Alberta or straight up through the Liard Basin area. Like it's enormous how big this is. And yet we know so little about it as regular citizens, and we tend to only see the impacts when it's almost too late. So hence, I appreciate the fact that you have good information sharing agreements with our transboundary partners, and hopefully information will be communicated as reasonably and as effectively as possible given the circumstances. So Mr. Minister, I'll pass the mic to you and allow you to provide any final thoughts on the occasion of being here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to committee for the opportunity for us to be here today. I know that this issue is certainly top of mind for all of the folks in the Northwest Territories, and I think it's, as the ongoing drought and the impacts of climate change impact us all in many areas, I think it's important work that we're doing, and I really want to thank Dr. Kelly, Dr. Conan, and Assistant Deputy Minister for their work here today. I think it's we've made some good strides, and I think a lot of really good work is being done in this area, and we hope to continue to move forward. So thank you.
Thank you again, and appreciate your time today. Thank you. And I'll now call it a close and wish everyone a good day. Cheers.